I am Laura Spate, Executive Director of the Policy Center. As we continue to advance the success of minority farmers, the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center, located at Alcorn State University, is creating a series of video podcasts designed to educate minority farmers, ranchers, and agricultural professionals on agricultural policies impacting minorities and their communities. Each podcast will focus on an area of agricultural policy and its impact on minority farmers. Thank you.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Policy Center Live. My name is April Love. I'm the policy analyst with the Policy Center, and today we are at the Congressional Black Caucus Institute Mississippi Policy Conference here in Biloxi, Mississippi. And we have Dr. Dewayne Goldmon, who is the Senior Advisor for Racial Justice and Equity for USDA. He is going to discuss with us the Inflation Reduction Act and equity and racial equity. Dr. Goldmon, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ms. Love. It's a pleasure being here.
Great. So we're going to go ahead and get into a discussion about the Inflation Reduction Act and some very specific areas of the Inflation Reduction Act. But before we get started, Dr. Goldmon, can you kind of give us an overview of your role with USDA?
Sure. As a senior advisor, I'm expected to advise the Secretary on policies, procedures, programs, personnel, anything that impacts equity at USDA. With your affiliation with the Policy Center, I don't have to tell you that we have some disparities in our programs and people that we need to address. And so in serving the role as an advisor to the Secretary, another important part of my job is to try and stay as connected as I can to those people we're trying to serve. So maintaining a relationship with the Policy Center is vitally important, as it is to maintain relationships with a lot of other groups that represent farmers, ranchers, landowners who haven't had full access to USDA in the recent past.
Great. That's a very important role, and it's very necessary, especially based on the research and the recommendations that we've been putting forth from our office. So just to jump right in, can you give us a brief overview of the Inflation Reduction Act? What is it? And why do you think it was an important piece of legislation?
The Inflation Reduction Act is a big, comprehensive piece of legislation. It was actually passed signed into law by the President in August of 2022. For farmers, and I'll say particularly for black farmers, there are two sections in there that really require USDA to do serious work in addressing some of those historical inadequacies that's present at the department. So Section 22006 deals with distressed borrowers, and those are borrowers who are distressed in their Farm Service Agency loan payments. And then there's another the next section, 22007, provides several resources to deal with creating and standing up a more equitable USDA. So there's actually 5 sections in 22007 dealing with things like increasing access to capital, land, access, better serving minority serving institutions. The Equity Commission itself is supported in that one. Programs to deal with historic issues such as heirs property is in that one. And then the final section of 22007 is one that we'll be talking about quite a bit here at the Congressional Black Caucus Policy Institute, and that is providing financial assistance for those farmers who have suffered from discrimination in farm lending programs. And so, those two sections in particular really direct USDA to provide resources to help us on our journey toward equity.
Okay. So that last section that you discussed has really been a hot topic amongst farmers, and I would even say amongst Black farmers. While that section can help a lot of people, we all know that Black farmers have been on the decline for a number of years, and they are a population that is falling out. So how do you think that this piece of legislation, even though it can help a lot of farmers and a lot of farmers of color, how can it specifically help Black farmers?
Great question. And I should point out that the Inflation Reduction Act, as written, is a combination of prior legislation.
Yes.
Okay? And I don't want to get too far in front of you, but I think this would be an appropriate time to talk about the transition from the Justice for Black Farmers Act to the current Inflation Reduction Act. And it's kind of a three-step process that provides a pretty logical journey towards the Inflation Reduction Act. I've been at the department since March 1, 2021. Prior to that, I served as executive director of a nonprofit, the National Black Growers Council. Prior to that, I served 30 years in the agricultural, chemical, and seed industry. And a large portion of that time was spent walking beside the few remaining Black farmers we have on their farms and learning about their plight. And I can recall the comfort that I myself felt when I figured out that, because I'm a farmer myself.
Yes.
I'm a third generation farmer. I grow corn, rice, and soybeans in Arkansas. And I can recall the pains of being discriminated against. And it still is difficult to talk about because it's a gut punch that no human should want to witness another human going through. But I can also recall the comfort that I reached when you find out that, Dewayne, it's not just you. This is a system that needs to be fixed, okay, to better serve Black farmers. And so the first modern, realistic attempt at that was the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And that law came into existence around 2019, 2020, when I was executive director. So we weighed into that. It had some good language, had a lot of good stuff in it, April. But when it came down to it, I think a lot of us realized that because this is a Black farmer thing, this could be difficult to gain legislative support for. This could be difficult to bring into existence.
And might I add, they are still, Justice for Black Farmers Act is still out there, is still, being pushed. It's been reintroduced yet again. And so there are still people out there, fighting for the Justice for Black Farmers Act. But it has been very difficult, which led to, what you're discussing with the progression of the legislation.
And so, I think we can agree to that. So kind of a more realistic compromise was made, I think, as we went from the Justice for Black Farmers Act to the American Rescue Plan.
Yes.
And in the American Rescue Plan Act, signed into law on March 11th, 2021. I remember that because I'm 10 days into the job, and it was revolutionary legislation.
It was.
And I'll point to two sections in particular. Section 1005, which dealt with paying the debt for socially disadvantaged farmers as defined in the original language, meaning that these are farmers of color, okay? And so we immediately started implementing that program. And as we were implementing that program, there were several things that came to light, okay? One was all the farmers of color didn't have the proper paperwork on file to indicate that they were farmers of color. Now, I understand that because if you are concerned about the discrimination that you might face as you're filling out a farm loan, why would I tell I'm Black, but once I put it on paper, everybody that sees that application knows I'm Black. And so, yes, I understand it. And so for the first time, we had a very tangible, legitimate reason for you telling the United States Department of Agriculture that, yes, I'm black, I'm Hispanic, I'm Native American. And so we were able to significantly increase the number of people that qualify for that benefit. This is a part that surprised me, but not other people who were familiar with this kind of stuff, right? The fact that almost immediately people started working on trying to stop this. And so we found ourselves pretty quickly, faced with 13 different lawsuits. And we were hit with injunctions and stoppages that said this would be reverse discrimination because white farmers were categorically left out. And I struggled with that.
Yes.
So you mean to tell me the very thing that prevented me from getting a loan cannot be used to provide some kind of, atonement for the discrimination that I suffered and prior generations of people that looked like me also suffered from. Suffice it to say, we had what we had. And so as we were going through the different options in dealing with the American Rescue Plan, the loan forgiveness program, a couple other things. One, this is going to litigation.
Yeah.
Who knows how long it's going to take, Ms. Love, and what the eventual outcome will be.
Yes.
I will say this, as a farmer, I fully understand seasons. Mm-hmm. You might have heard me say this before. Every spring we start preparing, we plant seeds, we take care of it. In the fall we start harvesting. It's a season, it creates the rhythm of agriculture. And every time we miss a season, we tend to lose farmers. And those farmers that are suffering the most tend to be the first ones that fall off the edge of the cliff.
Yes.
And that's our black, in a lot of cases, that's our black farmers. So if we win this thing 5 years, 10 years from now, and we've lost 5, 10 seasons of black farmers, and they are still the most rapidly declining demographic,
Yes.
have we really won?
Yes.
And so when Congress stepped in and said, we've got to think of something better, the Inflation Reduction Act took two parts of the American Rescue Plan. Section 1005, which dealt with debt forgiveness for farmers of color, it repealed that, took it off the table,
Yes.
and put in the distressed borrower section, Section 22006, $3.1 billion to pay the debt for distressed borrowers, and left some discretion up to USDA as to how they defined distressed. And so at this conference in the morning from 9:30 till 11 o'clock, my Farm Service Agency colleagues will be in the room to take a deep dive into the mechanics behind the distressed borrower payment. So I won't try and steal their thunder, but I will say the initial definition was defined as those that were 60 days or more delinquent. So before we even made an announcement, we looked within FSA's records and we could identify those loans. So we paid those loans current plus made one additional payment to do what the Secretary has described, what Secretary Vilsack has described as getting farmers out of the ditch, so to speak, taking them from simply surviving from one year to the next to actually thriving from one season to the next, and being able to do business with a farm service agency that's a little rejuvenated, a little more equitable, and able to help people through some difficult times, okay?
Yes.
So the Farm Service Agency has also taken additional measures, indicators of distress, to make automatic payments to people, plus one, meaning you pay one forward, to get them in position to actually more fully participate in programs. That program is going well, okay? The other thing was 22007.
Yes.
For the most part, it's close enough to being accurate to say that the first four sections were pretty much left alone. The Equity Commission, the MSIs, the North, all that was left alone. The discrimination, the section providing financial assistance to farmers who had suffered from discrimination in farm lending programs was modified. And I'll say it was enhanced. If you look at the American Rescue Plan, Section 1006, the maximum amount of funding that could have gone to the discrimination piece was $800 million. When it was retooled, there's now $2.2 billion in that section to provide financial assistance for those farmers who suffer from discrimination. And there'll be a session in the morning, another deep dive with vendors in the room, with farmers in the room, to update this body as to how that program is going to work, and that's going to be important. But it's $2.2 billion there now. Applications opened on July 7th. They will remain open through October 31st.
Okay.
And we're serious about trying to make sure that we have a process that will provide financial assistance for farmers who suffer from discrimination. In my career in agriculture, Ms. Love, I tend to be optimistic. I like to look forward because I subscribe to the notion that there's more opportunity in the windshield than in the rearview mirror. But every now and then, we find ourselves in a position where we have to look back. When you know some of the atrocities that our farmers of color, and I'll say black farmers,
Yes.
When you know some of the things that black farmers have gone through generationally, it requires us to take a look back and say we have to provide some assistance for those folks who've suffered at no fault of their own, but the system has failed some folks. And so this program is vitally important to help us reposition, work through organizations like the Policy Center and other organizations, but work through organizations to regain their trust and provide them better service. That's the opportunistic view of that discrimination piece. But again, we have to look back and make atonements for some of the missed opportunities that folks have gone through.
I 100% agree with that. I know that one of a bit of the more excitement around this funding that you mentioned, I know that when the Policy Center started looking into the original debt relief, we found that a large percentage of black farmers weren't going to get that debt relief because they never even had a loan through USDA, and that led us to a large research project looking at where these farmers were getting their funding. And so now, even if they didn't have funding from USDA, maybe they can get some type of relief from the discrimination that they faced, which kept them from getting the loans from USDA. So Dr. Goldmon, I would love it if you would just leave us with your final thoughts. What is your hope for the future going forward for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers and black farmers? Do you have some hope that there will be some things that will change?
Yeah, and it's I've often said I had the opportunity to serve in a number of different positions that put me in a position to advocate, to be an advocate, as people say, but to advocate for people who to advocate, right? but to advocate for people who really were not at the table when certain policies were being developed.
Yes.
And I would say that black farmers fit in that category because up until the 60s, you really were left out of things like voting and speaking up and standing up for your rights. You really didn't have a real opportunity at doing that. But in serving in that role, either as a member of a Minority Farmer Advisory Committee or an advisor and then executive director to the National Black Growers Council, and then being, I consider myself an alumni of the advisory board of the Policy Center, just being in the room when folks are talking about some strategies to make improvements as we go forward. I think those things collectively led me to this position as a senior advisor for racial justice and equity. And I don't take it lightly. I understand the seriousness of the work that we're doing. When I was talking to Secretary Vilsack about this position, he advised me, he warned me that, Dewayne, there's going to be some days that you're going to get frustrated, and you're going to feel like, why am I doing this? Are we really making progress? But he said, I can assure you that with your experience, we will. He said, but I have a question for you. He said, you need to think about how will you define success in this role? And I thought about it for a minute, April, and I said, you know what, Mr. Secretary, I won't consider myself successful until my services in this position are no longer needed. Meaning that USDA is to the point where we don't need a senior advisor for racial justice and equity. People are treated fairly. People have opportunities to fully participate in USDA. Now, before you call me crazy, I'm no longer thinking that this will get done in 4 or even 8 years. But it still doesn't keep me from putting that as my goal. Yeah. Because, you know, once we can take an objective look at sound information, data, and determine, you mentioned the debt relief program.
Yes.
When you look at disparities in farm loan programs and you find that on average only 8% of black farmers of record had loans. Mm-hmm. So you have to ask the question, and to your research project, why? and what about the other 92%? Where are they getting their phones and what? So you have to ask those questions. And then the other question though you seriously have to ask is, if we look at white farmers, what's that number?
Yes.
And if there's a difference there, we can either say, okay, I understand the difference. Mm-hmm. There's no discrimination there. But if there is a difference, and there is, and you find that there's not a logical, plausible explanation as to why that disparity is there, guess what? We got some work to do.
A lot of work.
And so when I think about, when I think about my position, it is to get to the point where we no longer have to identify areas where we need to make significant improvements because of the race or the size or the gender of our customers, that people have full access, that they're getting treated equitably, yes. Meaning they're getting what they need to be successful in their operations. And we have a ways to go before we get there. But thank God, I'm not doing this by myself. I have the Policy Center, I have a lot of other resources, I have colleagues across the department that are serious about this work. And I think we have sufficient momentum to make some meaningful change.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Goldmon. I know that you've been a wealth of knowledge for everyone who is tuning into this episode. So thank you for tuning into the Policy Center Live, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.